Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 167, The Origins of Medieval Theatre, a conversation with Kyle Thomas. For this guest episode, we welcome Kyle Thomas to the podcast. This is the first part of our conversation, where we discuss that very long transition period between Roman late antique theatre and the rise of the medieval theatre. As you may remember from my episodes on the medieval theatre, this is a very opaque period where details are few and far between. In my episodes in Season 3 of the podcast, I mostly followed the view that medieval theatre grew out of parts of the church liturgy that became dramatised as very simple short plays as part of the church service. As you will hear in our conversation, Kyle puts a more nuanced perspective on that and also speaks to the role of the education system of the time in that process. Kyle A. Thomas is a theatre historian, a professional actor, a director and a theatre critic. He recently left his position at Missouri State University after reinvigorating the BA theatre programme there, and now serves as adjunct professor of theatre at North Park University in Chicago, where he is also resident ensemble member of Stage Left Theatre. A specialist in early medieval theatre and drama, Kyle's publications reveal how performance shaped social and cultural practices in pre-modern Europe. His direction of medieval plays includes the play of Adam at the Metropolitan Museum of Art Cloisters in New York City in 2016. He is also chief editor of the journal Romard, research on medieval and Renaissance drama. You can watch him on screen as part of the Discovery Channel's Mysteries of the Abandoned, Hidden America, or as the Theatre History Professor on YouTube. As you can tell, Kyle is a very busy man, so I was very pleased that he found time to talk to me from the University of Chicago over a Zoom call. So because we like to divide things into historical periods, theatre tends to get compartmentalised into Roman theatre, then followed by medieval theatre, as I must confess I did myself on the podcast. But that period from classical to late antiquity to the early Middle Ages, it's a long period of time. And we know that theatre did survive, clearly. So how do you see that as a transition period? And maybe it's not right to even call it that. And what evidence do we have to support your thinking on that?
Yeah, I think that this question of periodization is really interesting because if you look at, let's start with what we're talking about with the early Middle Ages, this period that I believe in your previous episode, you discussed it and talked a little bit about how it used to be called the Dark Ages. And we don't like that term so much anymore.
Definitely not.
Yes. So, when we talk about the early Middle Ages, we're usually referring to a period in time that starts around the 6th century and can run as late as, say, the 12th century or, very, very early 12th century. And I think I maybe need to start by giving a picture of what this dramatic and theatrical world looks like at this time period. You do have a lot of itinerant performance. You have a lot of performers kind of in a minstrel way. Again, I'm actually drawing a lot from what you talked about because I think you create a really good picture in this broad way of what is happening across the European landscape as the structures of imperial Rome are beginning to not always corrode, but in some cases transfer into the Germanic kingdoms and these new polities that are forming. Some of which are based on Roman models and structures and foundations, and some of which are kind of created out of whole cloth. But their courts and their emphasis on performance is certainly recorded. We know that, for example, Sidonius Apollinaris in the 5th century talks about in the court of Theodoric, the King Theodoric of the Visigoths, he is allowing these comic actors to come in and do these very slapstick, somewhat probably improvisational types of performance. He believes this to be very beneath a king and how dare they be there, and that shouldn't be happening. If you look a little later, you've got the famous Carolingian courtier Alcuin of York, who is really warning against allowing these kinds of performers to come into places like monasteries and churches and to ply their trade in those places. So there's certainly a lot of polemical viewpoints that are essentially the record that we have of these kinds of theatrical performances happening. But if we take this picture and then we kind of look backwards in time for a more exploded, more expanded, more formalized type of theater, hopefully that's occurring in earlier centuries, it kind of matches with the traditional periodization that we use, where Rome essentially kind of dissolves, for lack of a better word, declines in the late 5th century with the abdication of Romulus Augustulus in 476. We really kind of had this formal end date that we like to put on that. But if you are trying to kind of find a much more formalized Roman style of theater in those particular centuries, you're really not going to find much. So in kind of if we're looking at periodization specifically from a theatrical sense, the picture of theater performance and to some degree drama is very similar, going as far back as the 4th century. So really this period of shifting theatricality begins as early as the Roman imperial period. And you have to remember that there's not a whole lot of new plays being written by as early as the 2nd century. We have this decline in playwriting. So there are not a lot of new dramas coming out. In fact, I kind of equate this, if I'm teaching this type of subject, I'll equate it to for my students to kind of the last 20 or so years of filmmaking in our modern world, where you have a lot of revivals of old films and television shows that were really popular, say maybe a generation or so ago. You've got the kind of serialistic model of filmmaking where you're basically taking one story and kind of continually building upon it, but using a lot of the same characters. The plays of Greece and Rome that really explode in this golden era, say starting in the 5th century BC and going all the way up to about the 1st century CE, that era really comes to an end. And what we see really are this kind of not romanticized, but a kind of this sense of nostalgia for this era. And so a lot of these plays and the characters from these plays are finding their ways into other forms of theatrical performance, be they a more improvisational form that is tied to this kind of street type performance, or these very semi-permanent or impermanent stagings where you're building platforms and those sorts of things and having people come out and see a show for a short time before it's all taken down and moves on to the next town or city. And while formal theater is still going on, the big theaters that we know in places like Rome and modern day Lyon in France, and even in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Roman world, there are certainly these large theaters, and they're still being used, and they still have these big, large performances going on, plays by Terence and Plautus and other playwrights. But that really begins to shift starting in the 4th century as Christianity takes hold in the Roman Empire at all kind of social strata levels. And you have people like St. Augustine, or in the Western Latin world, or John Chrysostom in the Greek-speaking Eastern world. And they're both railing against theatrical performance. And they're both saying, this is pagan. It's false in its foundations. It's all built on this kind of on a bed of lies, so to speak. And it's essentially celebrating the more evil, nefarious forces of the world and of the supernatural, and thus we need to move away from it. But there's a key distinction to make in this kind of 4th century context, that they're not talking about drama; they're talking about theater. They're talking about spectacle. They're talking about ludi. Where, you really kind of hit upon the language and the verbiage of this world and how it's recorded, and that's really what they're attacking, is this spectacle-driven form of performance where you go to these large spaces that are purpose-built for these activities, and the way that it affects the soul and the individual is the concern of these particular polemicists, Augustine, Chrysostom, and others. And that really does follow. We don't see a lot of new drama and plays emerging after that period. Very little playwriting is happening. And theater especially also begins to decline in that way, that formalized sense of it. And that's not just because of the Christian perspective. That's also because the economic situation of Rome really shifts. You have very little ability to afford these kinds of performances. the individual senators and civic leaders who would typically fund these types of events are not doing that anymore. Their focus and their concentration and their economic interest has changed over time in these later centuries of the Roman imperial period. And so what we see in the by the time we get to this period that we really call the early Middle Ages, this post-Roman world where you have a different kind of format, different structure to the European landscape. You've got a Christian church, which is becoming much more formalized as well in its own structures and more powerful in its ability to exert its perspectives more broadly across the western side of the continent. All of this together, by the time you get to that sense of things in what we call the early Middle Ages, it's not too terribly difficult from what's been going on in previous centuries in a period that we know very much to be the Roman imperial period. So, to speak to the question of periodization, I think it certainly helps us out to be able to mark certain points in time that we can adhere to as like nodes of activity where we can look at both economic, cultural, and social waves happening across this landscape. There's not a lot different that's going on in between those two periods of Roman imperial, late antiquity, and into the early Middle Ages. And I will say this too, though theater and performance, this kind of formal sense of things does decline, drama doesn't. Even though plays aren't really written, drama becomes something I think different. It infuses itself into other forms of literature and other forms of writing that become particularly significant a little bit later. But I bet we will probably get to that. So I'll just leave that as a teaser.
So there's a combination of the general decline of the empire, of the Roman Empire, the influence of Christianity. All of that is working against formalized theatre on the scale that the Romans were performing it by that time, which was, of course, they'd gone away from the mobile model and they built these big stadia for theatre and other things. Always had rather the sense that theatre was the poor relation of the games and the arenas. Generally speaking, there's that famous quote of the Roman playwright who said people were leaving his play because there was a boxing match going on.
Yeah, and that's true. Yes, that's very true. The theater is this kind of they're all kind of wrapped up into these ludic activity. You see that in the famous Isidore of Seville, his work, The Etymologies. He kind of classifies all of these things together. Roman spectacle meaning everything from gladiatorial combat to more formalized games like kind of track and athletic competition, boxing, the type of chariot games that occur. And then he kind of lumps in, and then they were doing these plays too. And there was, the plays of Terence and Plautus in particular were very, very popular. And then you've got all these other things like dancers and kind of these mimetic type of performances, which were usually probably very erotic in their tonality and what they were trying to accomplish effectually. This is all very, very much happening. But theater is kind of this, in some cases, in some places in the Roman Empire, more the stuffy form of ludic activity. Not quite as fun, not as brash and as boisterous and as exciting at every moment as, say, a chariot race or a gladiatorial combat.
And so after the fall of the empire, you would say that the fact we have no evidence of written down plays or large performances in the same way does mean there weren't any, or there were very few. And it's not a question of just we've lost all that information.
Correct. Yeah, I don't think that it is. I think that it's largely a cultural shift. And that's why I think this periodization model, if we follow the standard kind of line between the Roman imperial or late antique period ending at about the end of the 5th century and then this early medieval period beginning after, doesn't really fit if you look at it solely from theater history, because there's just an ongoing kind of cultural shift, like a tectonic shift, very slow and maybe a bit unperceived. But as the Christian world really begins to emerge from within the Roman world, drama doesn't die. The sense of the dramatic and the effect of drama and its ability to be captured in literature through both in a dialogic form, but also just in the sense of kind of how the stories are crafted and the ways in which they are meant to affect an audience. Those things begin to don't die off. They just take a different shape and a different form. So while drama is not taking the form of a play, a script that you and I might look at and say, yes, this is clearly something meant to be staged. It's meant to be picked up by an actor and interpreted in this representational performance. There's still drama very much at work. The best example in my mind, is Prudentius and his very dramatic poem, the Psychomachia, which becomes incredibly popular in the early Middle Ages. There are numerous copies in manuscripts across the medieval world, across the European landscape that are really circling around this world in the early part of the Middle Ages. This is some call it a late antique poem written in I believe the fourth or fifth, early fifth century. And in it, what's really fun about the Middle Ages is that these medieval scribes that are copying this poem also begin to create illustrations with it. And they essentially kind of stage visually within the manuscript these. If you're not quite familiar with this poem, it is the battle of the soul, the battle of these virtues, which later Hildegard of Bingen is obviously influenced by in her Ordo Virtutum when she writes that in the 12th century. But this is a very early kind of allegorical battle that is happening in a very Christian way. It is these Christian virtues, faith and hope and love and fidelity and so on and so forth, that are quite literally at war with and in combat with these other more negative forces, allegorical forces. Like, for example, the old gods. There's one that's called the worship of the old gods, meaning the pagan Romans, and the character of, I believe, Faith. I can't remember off the top of my head at the moment, but there's very violent descriptions of how these characters engage in combat, and all of this is depicted in these very early medieval manuscripts in this visual form. It's the output of the scribe who's being affected by the dramatic quality of the poem and realizing it in these visual ways. Now, whether the poem itself was performed as an act of theater, as an act of standing up and poetically representing these allegorical characters from the poem, we have no evidence of. But I think it's really important to kind of this standard narrative where drama is on the decline at the same time that theatrical spectacle is on the decline isn't exactly true. These two, they don't parallel one another.
Right.
There's certainly a coexistence of drama. It takes new forms. It takes new, in a literary sense, new stages. But it is theatrical. This formalized theater, this large, space-specific, site-specific type of theater that does certainly go away, only to reemerge in the space of the monasteries a little bit later in the early medieval period.
Yes, that makes it all very interesting that the reemergence of drama of theatre rather, comes through the church, which is kind of the least intuitive thing that you think might have happened.
Yeah. Because we have so much of the polemical perspective on theater is obviously starts with these church figures, as I mentioned earlier, Augustine, Chrysostom, a few others, but it is really embraced by these monastic houses first, and then later kind of the cathedrals and the cathedral schools and their structures as well. And my theory behind this is because drama is still everywhere within the monastery. And in fact, the monastery, the structure of the monastic setting is very much a system of imitation. It is a place in fact, St. Benedict Nursia, who writes the Rule of St. Benedict, which becomes kind of the foundational structural document for monasticism in the Latin Christian world. He talks very much about this kind of system of imitation that it should exist. An abbot should imitate the good shepherd, the pastor bonis, and that from the abbot down, there should be this emphasis on imitation as a means to spiritual erudition. So in order for one to find their place within the monastery, but also to find their place within this larger kind of cosmic structure, they have to imitate the good works, the good deeds, the good example of their superiors. And this isn't just about, learning the ways of the monastery. This is a lifelong process. This is not solely confined to a few years of education. And so the monastery is a place where scribes are also copying down the Roman plays. So as I mentioned, drama doesn't disappear. The plays of Terence and Plautus and even some earlier Greek examples continue to be copied and to be read and to be studied from the late antique period well into all throughout the Middle Ages, actually, and even into the early modern period. These are highly popular plays. In fact, there are several manuscripts from all over the medieval period and all over Europe that are just the plays of Terence. That's all they are.
Yeah.
A whole manuscript is just that. So they're certainly being enjoyed. They're certainly being studied. They're read and not only used for these studies, but in some cases we have examples where they're discussed as used for Latin instruction, how to speak in a very informal tone about in Latin as one may be learning it as a part of their monastic education. So all of this is happening within these monasteries, and as the monasteries are forming, and as the church is using monasteries become very powerful places, and they actually become kind of the source by which the church exerts a lot of its authority in these early centuries of the medieval world. And in that respect, the church is still kind of formulating how it's going to exert its own beliefs and approaches to kind of a Christian world that is certainly shifted, where you don't have these super powerful emperors and rulers and military leaders who can enforce certain theological or doctrinal practices and perspectives. The monasteries become these hubs where you can do that, and where you can then from there kind of spring out and affect a wider populace, because monasteries, despite being places where you want to separate yourself a little bit from the world, this kind of eremitical idea, they quickly become some of the biggest landowners in Europe. They become places where markets are very accessible for the average individual. And monks have as their call from St. Benedict this idea of protecting the laity. Their job, they see it, is to help the laity live their Christian lives and to protect their souls. And that's why we do eventually see these liturgies really emerge from these monastic spaces as well.
And those liturgies make it into the church and into the church service, which is a kind of a performative experience in itself.
Oh, very much. Yeah.
And then we develop the call and response, which is then developed into a rudimentary form of acting within church services.
In a way, I struggle with this, to be honest with you, because I don't, in the same sense that I wouldn't today want to call someone's experience with their faith, with the ritual performances of their faith, I would not want to call that theater, because we don't want to, and nor would I call the participants at the heart of it actors either, because I think that's those are two different things. So where I kind of get a little, where I think what we need is, where I believe that the liturgy is influenced greatly by drama. I think it's influenced by the study of these plays that we've been talking about, these earlier Roman Latin plays. I think it's influenced by the dramatic affect of poetry and philosophy and educational texts that are written in these kind of dialogical forms. I'm thinking of texts like Marcianus Capella's Marriage of Mercury and Philology, or Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. These are incredibly important educational texts that we find all throughout early medieval monasteries, and they're highly dramatic texts that are having an effect upon the reader that is emotional and that is deeply felt. And so combining all these, and then you also have this world that is built highly on imitation. And so naturally, as the liturgies begin to develop, and I think it's also important, my grad school advisor was very keen on pointing this out to me and to scholars quite regularly, is that the term liturgy, liturgia, that word doesn't really exist until the early modern period. We don't see this actually in manuscripts until I believe the earliest attribution is the 16th century.
Right.
So this concept that the folks at the time in the early Middle Ages kind of quote unquote knew what they were doing in the sense that they're they're trying to create these dramatic liturgies. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think that they are influenced by the dramatic environment, if you want to call it ludic environment of the monastery. And they see as the liturgy is developed, and this is very much a time where we are debating, what rites are we going to use? We're going to use the Roman rite. We're going to use the Gallican rite, which was very common in Merovingian Europe, and then later into the Carolingian period until Charlemagne says, no, we have to follow with Rome. Let's do the Roman rite. So enough with the Gallican thing. We even have a Visigothic rite that still exists even all the way up into the Muslim conquest. So there's this this push and this pull with what a liturgy is and what worship is and what the Mass is supposed to be, and how for a monk in particular, how their day is supposed to be structured. At what points are we singing the hymns and reading the scripture and thinking on it and ruminating on it? How are our prayers structured? All of this, this kind of formation of the liturgical service and worship in this time period makes it right for drama to influence the way that these things are beginning to emerge and to form and to take shape over a great deal of the European landscape. I think one example of this might be there's a very early, I believe it's an 8th century text, the Book of Cerne. This is a manuscript that comes from, we don't really know exactly where it was created, but most scholars believe that it was written in Mercia in the middle of England sometime I believe in the 8th or 9th century. And it's a prayer book. Much of what the manuscript contains are psalms, calls to prayer, why one prays, kind of theological perspectives on what a prayer is, and then kind of model prayers that basically kind of serve in a way. I'm not going to say that it is, but in a way, as a script for the reader, for the person who is using this book as a means to conduct their own individual ritual for themselves. And at the end of it is this very interesting text called The Harrowing of Hell, which you may know from its later medieval antecedents that find their way onto the various pageant wagons and stages all around medieval Europe. It's a very, very popular tale, very popular play by the time we're getting into the mystery plays. But in this very early form, it is not a play. And it's not a narrative. It's kind of has a little bit of a dialogue, the way that it's structured, a bit of a dialogue. You see this between Adam and Eve and the various forces of the underworld of hell. And Christ's kind of triumphant entry into it and rescuing of them is described a little bit in this kind of way that is instructive. It's about this is what we're doing when we pray. And so it's all kind of contextualized within this larger ritual. But it's a very interesting piece to include within this manuscript that is about the personal approach to one's kind of performative ritual that they do in a very private and closed way. But if you begin to kind of expand out, you'll see that there are little bits and pieces of that strewn about all of these manuscripts. And I think that one of the things that we do a disservice of is treating these texts as if they are individual texts and not housed within a larger manuscript that itself contextualizes the way these texts may have been understood and may have been utilized within the monastic world and monastic environment. So I think that's one of the kind of interesting things about this world in which drama is swirling and activating aspects of the monastic life and the monastic world. But it makes perfect sense that it would find its way into the liturgy. But I do want to come back to kind of where I started with this and say that I do think we have to be careful that not every liturgy that shows the format of a dialogue, say the Quem Quaeritis, the famous Whom Do You Speak liturgy of the Easter season, the various manuscripts we have of it, some of them, it reads very like theater, that you have the Marys coming to the tune and they say what they're going to say. And then you have the angel who appears, the heavenly figure, if you want to call it that, who appears and asks them who they're looking for. And oh, it's Jesus of Nazareth. No, he's resurrected, that sort of back and forth. The call and response that we have. These are not they're drama for sure, but they're not theater. And I'm often very keen to point that out. I think that that's really important. Because if we center our understanding of theater on the liturgy, we are muddying the ritual context within which these things function and the aesthetics that come to be performed and come to be a part of the effect of these liturgies as a part of worship are not designed for entertainment or for even necessarily for education. These are about giving the individual Christian person, the worshiper, the monk, whomever it may be, the opportunity to access some connection with the divine. And in that regard, it is not theater. And we need to be very careful about how we say that. But it does have a lot of theatrical qualities, and it does have a lot of drama at its heart, for sure.
If we can take that manuscript of The Harrowing of Hell and see that as a precursor to theatre outside of the context of the church, do we have any other evidences like that might suggest how we get from some sort of drama performed within the church to the cycle play?
Yeah, and I think it's an educational thread. And I think this is best embodied by Grotsvit. And this is kind of why I'm a historiographer, probably more than anything else. And so I'm questioning how these narratives of history are formed. And so that's why I tend to push back a little bit against liturgical drama as the source of a new form of theater in Europe in the Middle Ages. I think that liturgical drama is an example of an already theatrical environment that is the monastery. And Grotsvit is the best example of this. And I love this because typically in the kind of narrative history of medieval theater, it does start with liturgical drama, really focuses on the liturgies. And then when we get to, say, the 12th, 13th centuries, when we begin to see these plays that have big liturgical concepts as a part of them, and they are plays, then, it's easy to make this connection. But we completely ignore a person like Grotsvit, this 10th century woman, a canoness at the Abbey of Gandersheim, and we write her out. She's marginalized in this history, and I think that's wrong. I think that we actually need to do more to center an individual like Grotsvit within this history, because she's actually representative of what's happening within the monastic environment and the ways in which drama is swirling around and touching every aspect of monastic life, such that it begins to create a theatrical impetus within the monastic individual. So
let's try and put that right and give her her moment in the light here, because I did mention her briefly in my season on medieval theatre, but as you say, really almost like an afterthought, because it is always presented in the literature I was reading as pretty much that, an afterthought and something that was happening. A bit odd because she's basically the only named playwright that we know from that time. And she's a woman, and she's an abbess or some role as a nun, all of which doesn't sound like someone who would be enjoying the plays of Terence and Plautus and then writing her own versions of them. So why don't you run over the history again here and remind everybody, or maybe tell them for the first time?
Yeah, so Grotsvit is a German canoness. Well, what that means is that she never takes a vow of holy orders, in the sense that she confines herself to a monastery, or she is confined to a monastery. But that's kind of like, I reach for a modern parallel, and the best thing I can come up with is kind of a retirement situation. She is likely a person of noble Saxon birth. We see this indicated in some of her prologue in her manuscript when she dedicates it to her abbess, a woman named Gerberga. But Grotsvit, so we have evidence that she likely was a figure within the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Great at the time. And almost certainly she knew his youngest brother, a man named Bruno. And these connections become really important, because this is building a picture of the world in which these people live, in which they operate, which a person like Grotsvit, the first named female playwright in European history, who needs to hold a more important position within that history. Someone like her is growing up in a world where she has access to this very important court that is kind of the cultural center of Europe at this time period. And Bruno is named by his oldest brother, the Emperor Otto, to be the Archbishop of Cologne. And Cologne in the 10th century is probably one of the premier cities in Europe. It is certainly within the kind of Roman, the world of the Holy Roman Empire, certainly one of these very, very important bishoprics that has a lot of power. And so Bruno has this very strong and very important position, and he's a fan of theater. He's a fan of theater and drama. I believe it's C. Stephen Yeager who writes about Bruno's desire to see performances at his own court and to see these kinds of plays take place. And I want to come back to Bruno here in a minute, but I know you're asking me about Kreutzwald, so I'm going to table that for just a second. So we know Bruno is this individual who's given to theatrical performance. He likes something about it. He's certainly taken with it. And Kreutzwald grows up in this environment where she's educated, so she has certainly had access to the plays of Terence and Plautus and others. She's had access to a world of education that is giving her, she can read Boethius, this great philosopher of earlier centuries, Marcianus Capella, who I've already mentioned, who is the person who really forms the educational structures of the day. Virgil, Ovid, these other poets and these other great Roman Latin writers. So she's certainly a very educated individual by the time she gets to Gandersheim. And while she's there, as a part of her work, as a part of her effort to contribute to the labor and eruditional aims of the monastic environment there at Gandersheim, she writes these poems and these plays. And the plays are really fascinating because they're not great reads. I'll just be honest. They're not the most exciting reads for us in the modern world. But if you can kind of look past some of the surface level aspects of it, you'll see that this is a very well constructed stuff that is taking into consideration the structure of Roman comic drama. So again, Terence, Plautus, these Roman playwrights, she's certainly following their structure, this idea of a dramatic arc which has a particular problem, and at the end of this arc, there is some type of resolution, and these characters that have particular qualities that we see within those earlier plays. But she's also taking from this it's not terribly recent, but it's a growing form by this time, the hagiography, the saints' lives and the saints' tale. And so she's using both allegory, but she's also using actual Christian saints as a part of these stories and storytelling, and as a key integral part of the dramatic experience that she wishes to create, because she knows that her fellow readers will also know the hagiographies of some of the saints that she mentions in these plays like Paphnutius, which is based on the saint of the same name. But she's also not only, so we've got hagiography, we've got Roman comic drama in there, and then we've also got Boethius. And this is a really interesting place where it emerges. So in the play Paphnutius, the main character, the saint Paphnutius, is teaching his disciples. That's where we open. So he has all of his disciples around him, and they're asking him questions about the nature of the cosmos. Like, why is it that humans seem so out of sync with God? And Paphnutius equates that to this cosmic harmony that God has instituted, and that man operates kind of as a world within himself, and he sets himself in opposition, in dissonance to the rest of this kind of cosmic harmony that God has instituted. And he's using a lot of music theory and a lot of a ratio building that is born out of Boethian arithmetic. So Boethius has two major treatises, one on math and on arithmetic, the De Institutione Arithmetica, and then De Musica are two of his major writings. And they make their way into these educational environments that Kreutzwald was trained within. And she's now incorporating them into the character of Paphnutius. She's quite literally putting it into his dialogue. And so what is actually represented isn't a historical setting with a saint surrounded by his disciples and the goings on that they have. It's actually a medieval classroom. It's the actual environment she's dramatically represented that she is familiar with, where a teacher teaches his disciples and is, in doing so, imitating the work of the saints. Again, imitation quality is really important there. And this play goes on, and there's much more to it than that. But you see pieces of this all throughout her plays. In Sapientia, the main character goes before the Emperor Hadrian. Again, historical setting, kind of taking back in time, but it's meant to be very current for her day, for Kreutzwald's day and age. And Sapientia has her three daughters with her. They're all allegorical figures. You have wisdom, Sapientia. You have charity, you have faith, and you have hope are her daughters. And they've been brought before the Emperor Hadrian because they're worshiping God. And Hadrian wants them to worship the Roman pagan gods. And there's this back and forth, this rhetorical debate happening between Sapientia and the emperor. Again, something very that we would see within the monastic educational environments of this day, 10th century. And so in the end, Sapientia, she has this great line about schooling this fool on arithmetical rule. That's what she says to her daughters about Hadrian. It's just this fun little alliterative play in English, but or a rhyming play that we have in English. But it's all of this kind of, like, Rot's Feet really shows us how we take the dramatic world that she is living in, this theatrical world, all these influences happening around her, and she wraps them up into what we can very distinctly call plays. And lest we think that she was not influential in her day, we have to remember that the manuscript, we only have one manuscript of her plays, but what we have comes from the Abbey of St. Emmeram in Regensburg, which is in Bavaria. And this was a very, very influential monastery, and one that was known for training teachers, the great magisters of the monastic world that come a little bit later. And what it's doing in Regensburg is probably contributing to that educational environment. And it traveled there from Gandersheim, which is in modern day the state of Niedersachsen, Lower Saxony, so kind of north central Germany. Mm-hmm. And so if it didn't stay in Gandersheim, if it traveled somewhere else, it's certainly having some kind of influence. Even though we don't have a lot of later copies, it doesn't mean that it isn't indicative or stands as an example of the kind of theatricality that is emerging from these monastic educational spaces. And I think that's a key aspect that we miss when we focus really hard on creating liturgical drama as the seed of a new theater within Europe in the Middle Ages.
And you wanted to go back to Bruno?
So Bruno, and I should mention to your listeners, if they Google Bruno of Cologne, they will get the wrong Bruno. They will get the Bruno who formed the Carthusians. The Bruno I'm speaking of is usually referred to as Bruno the Great. The silly medieval people and naming everyone the same thing. So Bruno. If we take it back to Bruno. Again, so kind of going back a little bit, so we're in kind of the middle of the 9th century here. Bruno is the Archbishop of Cologne, and one of the things that he does is he is either he founds it or he reforms it. I can't remember exactly what it is, but he's very much associated with the Abbey of Saint Pantaleon in Cologne. And Saint Pantaleon is important because right after Bruno dies. So this is late 10th century, early 11th century. All of these individuals begin to come out of Cologne who have this great training in theatrical performance, one of which is a man named Frohmund. And Frohmund ends up going to a monastery in Tegernsee, which is in southern Bavaria. And Tegernsee, after he gets there, really explodes as this kind of cultural force in the Bavarian world. But he's a poet and he's a magister, a teacher. So he's kind of in charge of the education of particularly the young monastics at this monastery in Bavaria. And we know because he talks about using performance as his way of teaching. He has this one description of where he takes his belt around his clothing and he uses it like a tail of a monkey. And he makes kind of wild sounds and all of that. He teaches songs and performances to his students, and he actually advocates for it with the abbot. He says we should be doing this because it's really not only engaging the boys in the monastery, it's making their life more enjoyable, and the spiritual experience that they have with the divine is more enjoyable, and that's the kind of effect we want to create. And so you have this individual who's contemporary with Rothschild, who is essentially doing many of the same things. He's kind of playing the role of Paphnutius. He is the teacher, but he also uses drama and theater as this really crucial aspect to his teaching and to helping get particularly young people within the monastery engaged within the monastic culture that is emerging from that. And there's little bits and pieces we see from other teachers as well that come out of St. Pantaleon, Bruno's kind of earlier acceptance of this theatrical world within his own court. So in where we look for it, we can certainly find evidence that at the very least, theatricality is being infused within these kind of medieval Christian contexts. But at the most, we certainly see kind of a new dramatic force that is beginning to affect the literature that is also coming out of these spaces. Kind of like what you mentioned at the top of our talk, that's really kind of the challenge of this era and this time period is there's so much space and so much geography and so many manuscripts. It's not like focusing just on Rome or on Athens. This is a very, very broad period and a very, very broad geography and really spans even different cultures. So that's what makes it so difficult to study as a historian. In terms of the kind of historical narrative of medieval theater in this period, when we move from this 10th century world where we're beginning to see theatricality and drama within these monasteries make its way at least to a prominent point within the monasteries and to some degree even outside of the walls of the monasteries, there's a lot that is following this rise in what we call scholasticism that emerges in the 12th century. And so scholasticism really fuels it. And all of a sudden we see in the 12th century, this is usually why we get this term, the 12th century Renaissance, this explosion in poetic literature and dramatic literature. And I want to mention, I think it's important to mention that one of the set of plays that we still have many copies of are elegiac comedies. And these are very bawdy, very rude, very uncouth plays that are written largely by schoolboys at these monasteries. And they are very interesting reads. I don't think they would do well being performed in today's world, given that they are highly misogynistic, typically very anti-Semitic as well. So, so just giving kind of that caveat there for your listeners out there. But they are interesting plays in that they are certainly following Roman models. But alongside of that, we have the liturgy influencing new plays as well. And I really think this is important to point out that the play that I studied and wrote my book on, the so-called Ludus de Antichristo, or the play about the Antichrist, it actually has liturgies in it, but it's not a liturgical drama in that it was never meant to be performed within a worshipful or ritual context. And this is really key. This is, I think, important to understand. It ties us back to this earlier period where we're seeing drama influencing the liturgy. Now what we're seeing by the 12th century, drama incorporating the liturgy. And in this case, for the play about the Antichrist, there are 4 liturgies in the play. None of them, they're all disconnected from the actual liturgical settings that they would have been used in. So there's one from All Saints' Day, there's one from Advent, there's one from just right after the Christmas season, and there's one that's a coronation liturgy, and it's from England. It's an English coronation liturgy that has made its way into a play from southern Germany in the 12th century. And we don't know how it got there, but the interesting thing is that the coronation that's happening in the play is the coronation of Antichrist. And so they actually perform the liturgy backwards instead of doing it the way that it's prescribed within the liturgical text. And in doing so, they are signaling the kind of inverted authority, the perverted authority, if you will, of Antichrist. He is this false ruler. He is doing things the wrong way. He's doing it backwards or, incorrectly. So they're using liturgies by this period to actually signal in theatrical and dramatic ways aspects of the characters and the world that these characters inhabit that would be very, very recognizable by people in the 12th century. They would go, oh, yes, I see what's happening here. That's the wrong way to do that liturgy. You shouldn't do it that way. And it makes perfect sense. So I think it's key to in forming this narrative between kind of the early medieval period and into the Central Middle Ages and the later Middle Ages, that the liturgies still exist. They're still there. But now drama is incorporating them in these aesthetic qualities and these aesthetic ways to create meaning that is theatrical and not ritual and not tied to actually to trying to worship God or be utilized within the mass or some structure like that.
My thanks to Kyle for taking the time to talk to me today. If that leaves you wanting more on medieval theatre, then you can find the complete season on medieval theatre on the podcast feed as Season 3. That's episodes 48 to 63. And Kyle will be back to discuss a project that he is currently involved with to produce medieval cycle plays for performance in summer 2025. I've put links to several of Carl's activities in the show notes, and he'll be back in a couple of weeks because next time it's back to Henry IV, where Shakespeare mixes the joys of victories for the Lancastrians with mourning for a dying king and the incorrigible scheming of Falstaff. In the meantime, if you haven't done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.